My name is Jessica, and 6 months ago, I was living what I thought was my dream life. At 29, I had landed the perfect marketing coordinator position at Pinnacle Digital Solutions, a prestigious tech company downtown. The salary was incredible, the benefits were amazing, and I was finally using my communications degree in exactly the way I had always envisioned. I had my own apartment, a reliable car, and for the first time since college, I was actually saving money instead of just scraping by. Everything seemed to be falling into place until one Monday morning when I walked into the office and discovered that my boss, Richard Blackwood, had been systematically destroying my career behind my back for months. What happened next changed everything, and by the time I was finished with my quiet revenge, Richard learned exactly why you should never underestimate the quiet ones in the office. If you are watching this because you have ever dealt with a toxic boss or workplace drama, drop a comment below letting me know where you are viewing from and hit that subscribe button, because this story is going to show you exactly how patience and careful planning can turn the tables on someone who thinks they hold all the power. Let me start from the beginning. When I first got hired at Pinnacle Digital Solutions, I was beyond excited. The company had an incredible reputation in the industry, and the interview process had been thorough but fair. I was brought in to handle their social media marketing campaigns and coordinate with various department heads on promotional strategies. The job description was exactly what I had been looking for, and the team seemed welcoming and professional during my initial meetings. My direct supervisor was Richard Blackwood, the marketing director. He was in his mid-40s, had been with the company for 8 years, and had a reputation for running a tight ship. During my first week, he seemed supportive and encouraging. He showed me around the office, introduced me to key players, and outlined his expectations clearly. Richard emphasized that he valued initiative, attention to detail, and team collaboration above everything else. He told me that previous coordinators had struggled because they did not take ownership of their projects, and he was hoping I would be different. For the first 2 months, everything went smoothly. I threw myself into the work, staying late to perfect campaign proposals, researching industry trends on my own time, and volunteering for additional projects whenever possible. My social media campaigns were performing well, with engagement rates consistently above industry benchmarks. I was building solid relationships with colleagues across departments, and I genuinely felt like I was making a meaningful contribution to the company's success. The first red flag appeared in month 3, but it was so subtle that I almost missed it entirely. During our weekly team meeting, Richard was reviewing campaign performance metrics. When he got to my social media numbers, he briefly mentioned that while the engagement was decent, he expected to see more innovation in future content strategies. This struck me as odd because just the day before, he had complimented me privately on the creative approach I had taken with our latest product launch campaign. A week later, something similar happened. I had prepared a detailed presentation for a client meeting, complete with market analysis and projected ROI calculations. Richard reviewed it beforehand and said it looked solid. But during the actual meeting, when the client asked about specific data points, Richard interrupted me mid-explanation to suggest that we should have included more comprehensive competitor analysis. His tone implied that this oversight was entirely my fault, despite the fact that he had approved the presentation without mentioning any concerns about competitor research. These incidents were small and could easily be explained away as normal workplace feedback, but something about Richard's behavior felt off. He was perfectly supportive when we were alone, but whenever there were witnesses, especially senior management, he seemed to find subtle ways to undermine my contributions or suggest that my work needed improvement. The situation escalated significantly in month 4 when we were preparing for the company's biggest campaign of the year. Pinnacle had landed a major client, a nationwide restaurant chain that wanted to rebrand their entire digital presence. This was a multi-million-dollar account, and success with this campaign could lead to long-term contracts and significant bonuses for the marketing team. Richard assigned me to coordinate the social media component of the campaign, which was supposed to work in conjunction with traditional advertising and email marketing efforts. I spent weeks developing a comprehensive strategy that included platform-specific content calendars, influencer partnership proposals, and detailed analytics tracking systems. The work was some of the best I had ever produced, and I was genuinely proud of what I had created. The night before our major presentation to the client, Richard called me into his office for what he said was a final through my materials review session. He went page by page, asking detailed questions and making notes. At the end of the review, he told me that everything looked excellent and that he was confident the client would be impressed. He even mentioned that this campaign could be a real career maker for me if we executed it properly. The next morning, I arrived at the office early to make final preparations for the presentation. When I tried to access the shared folder where all of my campaign materials were stored, I discovered that several key files were missing. The influencer partnership proposals were gone, along with the detailed content calendars and the competitive analysis that had taken me days to complete. In their place were outdated drafts that I had created weeks earlier, versions that were clearly incomplete and unprofessional. I immediately reached out to our IT department to see issue with the server, but they confirmed if there had been some kind of technical indicated that these replaced. The timestamps that all files were showing as deliberately deleted in changes had been made at 11:47 p.m. the previous night, just hours after my meeting with Richard. My heart was pounding as I realized what had happened. Richard had deliberately sabotaged my work on the most important project of my career, but I had less than 3 hours before the client presentation, and there was no way to recreate weeks of work in that time frame. I had backup copies of some materials on my personal laptop, but not everything, and what I did have was not organized in a presentation-ready format. I tried calling Richard to explain the situation, but his phone went straight to voicemail. When he finally arrived at the office, just 30 minutes before the client meeting, he acted completely surprised by the missing files. He suggested that perhaps I had accidentally overwritten the final versions with older drafts, a mistake that he said unfortunately happens sometimes when people were nervous about big presentations. The client presentation was a disaster. Without my complete materials, the social media component of the campaign looked amateur and poorly thought out. The restaurant chain executives asked pointed questions that I could not answer adequately because my supporting research had been deleted. Richard stepped in several times to apologize for the gaps in our presentation, explaining to the clients that coordination between team members had been more challenging than anticipated. After the clients left, clearly unimpressed with what they had seen, Richard called an emergency meeting with the entire marketing team. In front of everyone, he expressed his disappointment with how the presentation had gone and specifically mentioned that the social media strategy had not met the professional standards that Pinnacle was known for. He did not directly blame me, but his implications were clear to everyone in the room. That afternoon, I was called into a meeting with Human Resources and Richard. They informed me that while they appreciated my efforts on the campaign, there were concerns about my attention to detail and project management skills. They were not terminating me, but I would be placed on a performance improvement plan that would involve additional oversight and regular check-ins to ensure that similar issues did not occur in the future. I sat in that meeting, nodding politely and accepting their feedback, but inside I was seething. Richard had not just sabotaged my work, he had done it in a way that made it impossible for me to prove what had actually happened. To everyone else in the company, it looked like I had simply failed to deliver on the most important project of my career. That night, I went home to my apartment and did something I had never done before in my professional life. Instead of wallowing in self-doubt or immediately starting to look for a new job, I opened my laptop and began to plan my revenge. I knew that if I was going to expose Richard for what he really was, I needed to be smarter than him. Rushing into accusations or emotional confrontations would only make me look like a disgruntled employee who could not handle criticism. No, this required patience, documentation, and a level of strategic thinking that Richard clearly did not expect from someone he saw as just another disposable coordinator. The first thing I did was create a detailed timeline of every interaction I had had with Richard since starting at Pinnacle. I went through my emails, my calendar, and even my personal notes to reconstruct exactly what had happened and when. The pattern that emerged was more disturbing than I had initially realized. Richard had not just sabotaged the restaurant campaign, he had been systematically undermining me for months, always in ways that were subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. I remembered the weekly team meetings where he would praise my work privately beforehand, then find ways to critique it publicly. I documented the times he had asked me to stay late to work on projects, only to exclude me from the follow-up meetings where those projects were discussed. Most importantly, I realized that every major setback I had experienced could be traced back to Richard having access to my work just before something went wrong. But documentation alone was not going to be enough. I needed proof, and I needed allies. More than that, I needed to understand why Richard was targeting me specifically. This was not random workplace dysfunction. This felt personal and calculated, which meant there had to be a reason behind it. Over the next week, I started paying closer attention to office dynamics in a way I never had before. During lunch breaks and coffee runs, I began having casual conversations with colleagues from other departments. I was not asking direct questions about Richard, but I was listening carefully to how people talked about the marketing department and about previous employees who had worked in my position. What I learned was fascinating and deeply unsettling. I was the fourth marketing coordinator hired in the past 3 years. The 3 people who had held this position before me had all left within 6 to 8 months. And according to the gossip I was picking up, each of them had left under circumstances that involved questions about their competence or work quality. Sarah from accounting mentioned that the coordinator before me, a woman named Jennifer, had been really talented but seemed to have trouble with presentations toward the end of her time there. Miguel from IT remembered helping the coordinator before Jennifer with repeated file recovery issues that never seemed to get resolved properly. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was sickening. Richard was not just a bad boss. He was systematically driving people out of my position, probably to maintain some kind of control or to cover up his own incompetence. But why? What did he gain from having a constantly revolving door of coordinators who never stayed long enough to establish themselves or build relationships within the company? The answer came to me during a conversation with Linda, the executive assistant to the CEO. We were waiting for the elevator together when she casually mentioned how much she missed working with the marketing coordinators from a few years ago, back when they used to stick around long enough to really learn the business. Richard keeps saying he has not found the right fit yet, she told me with a shrug. But between you and me, I think he likes being able to take credit for all the coordination work himself. Hard to do that when you have someone competent working under you for more than a few months. Everything clicked into place. Richard was not trying to destroy my career out of personal malice. He was protecting his own position by ensuring that no one in my role ever became successful enough to threaten his status, or competent enough to expose his own limitations. This realization changed my entire approach to the situation. I was not dealing with a petty office bully. I was dealing with someone who had turned sabotage into a systematic strategy for career preservation. That meant I needed to be equally systematic in my response. I started keeping detailed records of everything. Every email Richard sent me got screenshotted and saved to a personal cloud account. Every verbal instruction was followed up with an email confirmation that created a paper trail. When he asked me to work on projects, I made sure to save multiple versions of my work in different locations, including sending copies to my personal email account. More importantly, I began to build relationships with people outside of Richard's direct influence. I volunteered for cross-departmental projects that gave me exposure to senior management. I made sure to attend optional company events where I could have casual conversations with executives who might not otherwise know who I was or what I was capable of. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the restaurant campaign disaster. Richard assigned me to coordinate a smaller campaign for a local business client, probably expecting that I would struggle with it given my supposed performance issues. Instead, I threw myself into the project with everything I had, but this time I was prepared for his sabotage attempts. I created the campaign materials as usual, but I also created decoy versions that contained subtle flaws. When Richard reviewed my work, I gave him access to the flawed versions while keeping the polished materials safely backed up elsewhere. Sure enough, the night before the client presentation, the files in our shared system were mysteriously corrupted. But this time, I was ready. The next morning, I sent an email to Richard, copying several other team members, expressing concern about the technical difficulties we had been experiencing with file storage. In the email, I mentioned that fortunately I had backup versions of all materials on my laptop, and I attached the polished professional campaign that I had actually prepared. The presentation went flawlessly. The client was impressed, the campaign was approved, and for the first time since starting at Pinnacle, I received public praise from senior management for my work. Richard looked stunned throughout the entire meeting, clearly having expected another disaster that he could use to further undermine my reputation. After the presentation, I received an email from the Vice President of Marketing, congratulating me on the campaign and asking if I would be interested in presenting my strategies to the broader executive team at their next quarterly meeting. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that Richard had been preventing me from having for months. But I was not satisfied with just one successful project. I had learned too much about Richard's methods to let him continue destroying other people's careers. I had seen the pattern, I had experienced his sabotage firsthand, and I had documented enough evidence to prove what he was doing. The question now was how to use that information most effectively. The answer came from an unexpected source. During a company-wide meeting about quarterly performance, the CEO mentioned that they were conducting a review of departmental efficiency and employee retention rates. He specifically noted that they were concerned about the high turnover in certain positions and were looking into ways to improve job satisfaction and career development opportunities. I realized that this review represented the perfect opportunity to expose Richard's behavior without looking like I was making personal accusations. If I could present the information as part of a broader analysis of departmental challenges, I could let the facts speak for themselves. That evening, I began preparing what would become the most important presentation of my career. Not a marketing campaign or a social media strategy, but a comprehensive analysis of the patterns I had discovered and the evidence I had collected. I was about to turn the tables on Richard in a way he would never see coming. I spent the next 2 weeks crafting what I privately called the Richard Report. This was not going to be an emotional rant about a bad boss or a personal vendetta disguised as corporate analysis. This was going to be a professional, data-driven presentation that would expose Richard's systematic sabotage through facts and patterns that could not be dismissed or explained away. The first section focused on departmental turnover statistics. I had reached out to HR under the guise of wanting to understand industry benchmarks for employee retention, and I had discovered that the marketing coordinator position had a 400% higher turnover rate than any other role at Pinnacle. In a company where most employees stayed for an average of 4 years, marketing coordinators were lasting less than 7 months. I cross-referenced the departure dates of my predecessors with project timelines and campaign performance data that I could access through our internal systems. What emerged was a disturbing pattern. Each coordinator had left shortly after experiencing what appeared to be major project failures or performance issues. But when I dug deeper into the actual campaign results, I found something fascinating. The campaigns themselves had often been successful with clients, but the coordinators had been blamed for various process problems or presentation issues that occurred during the development phase. Jennifer, my immediate predecessor, had left after what was described as a failure to properly coordinate with external vendors. But when I contacted one of those vendors directly, pretending to be following up on outstanding invoices, I learned that Jennifer had actually done excellent work. The vendor mentioned that there had been some confusion near the end of the project when someone from Pinnacle had called to make last-minute changes to specifications that Jennifer had apparently already finalized. The changes had caused delays and additional costs that were then attributed to Jennifer's poor planning. The coordinator before Jennifer had reportedly struggled with data accuracy issues that had embarrassed the company during a client presentation. But Miguel from IT had mentioned helping her recover files that kept getting corrupted. When I asked him more specific questions about those technical problems, he revealed that the corruption issues had only affected her files, and they had occurred multiple times right before important deadlines. AT had never been able to determine the cause, but Miguel admitted he had found it suspicious that the problems were so targeted. I was building a case, but I needed more than historical patterns. I needed current evidence, and I needed to document Richard's methods in real time. So I decided to create my own test scenario. I told Richard that I was working on a proposal for a new social media analytics tool that could help us better track campaign performance. This was actually a real project I had been considering, but I presented it to him as something I was developing independently to show my initiative. I explained that I wanted to research various platforms and create a cost-benefit analysis before proposing it to upper management. Richard seemed intrigued by the project and offered to review my research before I submitted anything formal. This was exactly the response I had been hoping for. I spent several days creating a comprehensive analysis of different analytics platforms, complete with pricing comparisons and implementation timelines. But I also created something else, a detailed tracking system that would allow me to monitor who accessed my files and when. Using a combination of document properties and cloud storage notifications, I set up alerts that would notify me every time someone opened, edited, or downloaded my research files. Then I gave Richard access to the shared folder and waited to see what would happen. The results were more damning than I had expected. Richard accessed my files 17 times over the course of 3 days, often late at night or early in the morning when he thought no one would notice. More importantly, the tracking data showed that he was not just reviewing my work, he was copying specific sections into separate documents and making his own versions of my research. On the 4th day, Richard called me into his office and told me that he had reviewed my analytics proposal and felt it needed significant revisions before it could be presented to management. He suggested that perhaps this kind of strategic analysis was beyond my current skill level, and maybe he should take the lead on researching new tools and platforms. I nodded politely and thanked him for his feedback, but internally I was celebrating. Richard had just walked directly into the trap I had set for him. Not only did I have evidence of him sabotaging my work, but I had proof that he was planning to steal my ideas and present them as his own. The final piece of my plan involved timing. I needed to expose Richard's behavior at exactly the right moment, when senior management would be most receptive to hearing about systemic problems and when Richard would be least prepared to defend himself. That opportunity came during the quarterly executive meeting where I was scheduled to present my local business campaign success. The meeting was attended by the CEO, all department heads, and several board members. It was the perfect audience for what I was about to do. I started my presentation exactly as expected, walking through the campaign metrics and client feedback from my recent success guard. I transitioned into a broader discussion. But then I did something that caught everyone off about process improvements and departmental efficiency. While working on this campaign, I became interested in understanding what makes some projects succeed while others struggle, I said, advancing to a success rates over the past 3 years. I decide slide that showed the marketing department's project to do some analysis of our departmental performance to see if there were patterns we could learn from. The room was completely silent as I walked through my data. I showed the turnover statistics, the correlation between coordinator departures and project timelines, and the pattern of technical difficulties that seemed to plague certain types of campaigns. I presented everything as objective analysis, never once mentioning Richard by name or making personal accusations. But the implications were unmistakable. When I showed a slide comparing the longevity of employees in different roles within the marketing department, Richard's face went completely white. When I displayed the timeline showing how project failures consistently preceded coordinator departures, he started shifting nervously in his seat. The CEO interrupted my presentation to ask pointed questions about the data. How long had I been tracking these patterns? Had I identified any common factors that might explain the correlation between technical difficulties and employee turnover? Did I have recommendations for addressing what appeared to be systematic issues? I answered each question professionally and thoroughly, explaining that I had noticed these patterns while trying to understand best practices for project management. I suggested that perhaps the company should consider conducting a more comprehensive review of departmental processes, particularly around file management and project handoffs. Richard finally spoke up, his voice strained as he tried to dismiss my analysis. "These are just coincidences," he said. "Employee turnover happens in every department, and technical difficulties are unfortunately part of working with complex digital systems." That was when I played my final card. I advanced to a slide that showed the analytics tool research I had been working on. "Speaking of technical difficulties," I said, "I have been developing a proposal for new analytics software that could help us better track and prevent some of these issues." I explained the research I had done, the platforms I had evaluated, and the potential benefits for the department. Then I mentioned that I had been collaborating with Richard on the analysis and that he had provided valuable feedback on the technical specifications. Richard's expression shifted from nervous to panicked as he realized what was happening. If he claimed credit for my research, he would be admitting to the behavior I had been documenting. If he denied involvement, he would look incompetent for not being aware of what his direct report was working on. The CEO asked Richard directly about his thoughts on the analytics proposal and whether he felt it should be a departmental priority. Richard stumbled through a response that made it clear he had not been involved in developing the actual recommendations, despite having had access to all of my research for days. After the meeting, I was approached by the Vice President of Human Resources, who asked if I would be available for a private conversation later that week. She mentioned that my presentation had raised some interesting questions about departmental efficiency that the executive team wanted to explore further. The conversation with HR was everything I had hoped it would be. Instead of having to make accusations against Richard, I was asked to provide additional details about the patterns I had identified. I shared my documentation, my analysis, and my recommendations for improving processes, all while maintaining a professional tone focused on helping the company succeed. Within 2 weeks, HR had launched a formal investigation into departmental practices and employee retention issues. Richard was asked to provide detailed explanations for the technical difficulties that had affected recent coordinators, the project management processes he had implemented, and his role in the departures of multiple employees. The investigation revealed everything I had suspected and more. IT records showed that Richard had been accessing coordinator files outside of normal business hours and making changes without proper documentation. Former employees were contacted and asked about their experiences, leading to a pattern of complaints that HR had previously dismissed as isolated incidents. Most damning of all, the investigation uncovered that Richard had been taking credit for successful projects that coordinators had developed, while distancing himself from any campaigns that encountered problems. He had been systematically managing his own reputation at the expense of the people working under him. Richard was terminated for cause 3 weeks after my presentation. The official reason given was conduct inconsistent with company values and breach of supervisory responsibilities. But everyone in the department knew exactly what had happened. I was offered Richard's position as interim marketing director while the company conducted a search for a permanent replacement. 6 months later, they offered me the role permanently, along with a salary increase that was double what I had been making as a coordinator. But the best part of my revenge was not the promotion or the money. It was the email I received from Jennifer, my predecessor, after word of Richard's termination had spread through industry networks. She thanked me for exposing what had happened and told me that she had spent months questioning her own abilities after leaving Pinnacle. Knowing that Richard's behavior was systematic rather than a reflection of her performance had helped her rebuild her confidence and find success at a new company. The other former coordinators reached out as well, each sharing similar stories of self-doubt and damaged confidence that had resulted from Richard's manipulation. Together, we ha at his previous level. Never found another position, all been victims of his scheme. But now word travels fast in our we were all free from his influence. Richer industry, and while the official details of his termination were kept confidential, enough information leaked to make him essentially unemployable in any senior marketing role. The quiet revenge I had planned had worked perfectly, but it had also taught me something important about workplace dynamics and personal power. Richard had counted on his victims being isolated, confused, and too overwhelmed to see the bigger picture. He had relied on people blaming themselves instead of questioning his methods. My success had not come from being louder or more aggressive than Richard. It had come from being more patient, more thorough, and more strategic. I had used the very skills that made me good at my job, research, analysis, documentation, and presentation to expose someone who had been abusing his position for years. Looking back, I realized that Richard's biggest mistake was underestimating me. He saw a young coordinator who seemed eager to please and assumed I would be as easy to manipulate as my predecessors had been. He never considered that I might be smart enough to recognize his patterns or determined enough to document his behavior. The experience changed how I approach leadership in my current role. I make sure my team members know they can come to me with concerns without fear of retaliation. I document everything, not to build cases against people, but to ensure transparency and accountability in all of quiet ones in the office might be the most dangerous opponents our processes. Most importantly, I never forget that if you give them a reason to act against you. Richard learned that lesson the hard way, recovered from the consequences of underestimating someone and his career. Never he thought he could control. Today, Richard is still unemployed, still trying to rebuild a reputation that will never recover, and I am thriving in a role that should have been impossible for me to reach under his leadership. The promotion, the respect from my colleagues, the financial security, all of that feels good. But what feels even better is knowing that Jennifer, Miguel, Sarah, and all the other coordinators who came before me finally have answers to questions that had been haunting them for months. If you are dealing with a toxic boss or workplace sabotage right now, remember this. Documentation beats confrontation every single time. Patience beats anger. Strategy beats emotion. Sometimes the best revenge is not getting mad or getting even, it is getting smarter and letting the truth speak for itself. Your toxic boss is counting on you being too overwhelmed, too isolated, or too afraid to see the bigger picture. Do not give them that power.